Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. I am Rachel from Rachel Reads. If you are new here, then welcome. So I have recently gotten back into historical fiction novels, and I know that it can be a difficult genre to start with. So what I thought I would do for you today is break down the different subcategories of historical fiction, talk about how you might like to get your toes wet, and give you a few recommendations. I'm also going to talk about how I started reading historical fiction and some of my favorites. There are several different subcategories of historical fiction, most of which I have at least tried. I don't like all of them, but most of them I am willing to have a go at. The reason I like to read historical fiction is I think it's a really easy way to get yourself immersed in that particular time period. For example, I really enjoy history. I really enjoy particularly 20th century history. So sometimes if I think I might be interested in a period, I might go and pick up a historical fiction set in that period, get introduced to it, and then if I am interested, I'll go and do some non-fiction reading in that particular area. And that's essentially why I started reading non-fiction. I also just find it interesting. So without further ado, let's talk about some of the different subcategories of historical fiction. So the first category is what I began with, and it's romance historical fiction. And I started with this quite early on in high school. And I started off with some guilty pleasures, which are Danielle Steele. So if you're looking for a really easy way to get into historical fiction, this is the way to go. And I think one of the first Danielle Steele books that I actually read was this one, which is Jules. And all three of the Danielle Steele books that I'm going to talk about, she writes heaps of historical fiction. It's, you know, it's not the greatest historical fiction in the world, but it is a good way to get your feet wet. So this one, Jules, is set after the end of World War I and into World War II, and most of Danielle Steele historical fiction are long spanning. They go for several decades, and this one is about a woman who gets married and they do up a chateau, and she lives in France through the occupation, and then and that's what I particularly enjoyed about this book, is learning about the occupation in France. You know, it's not the most historical accurate book in the world, but you do start to get to see some of the dynamics, and you know, it is a romance book. You got to consider that when you pick up a book like this. It is very much about romance. Danielle Steele likes to write about young women marrying much older men, and those men being almost saviors. What I did like about this book though is eventually the woman, the protagonist, becomes a widow, and she stands on her own 2 feet, and she becomes quite strong, and she survives the war by herself without her husband, because her husband is away fighting. And I really enjoy this because that is the story of most women who lived through the occupation, is they were alone with their children and they had to make the best of a bad situation. The next one that I like is also set in World War II by Danielle Steele, and this is Wings, and this is set in America. So the protagonist in this, Cassie, her father and her father's business associate were both World War I pilots, and she is desperate to become a pilot. Her father owns his own airfield in Chicago, and eventually she begins to learn how to fly, and she you know, it's all about her flying. She eventually becomes, it's kind of based on Amelia Earhart, and eventually she begins flying planes, supply planes in World War II. I really like this book. I like the setting, like that 1930s American Depression era. I thought it was really interesting. Again, it is a romance. You've got Cassie, the young girl who falls in love with her father's much older business associate. You can see it coming, but you know, it's a Danielle Steele book, so you can't really be surprised. And the last one that I'm going to talk about, and you can see it is very much loved, is again a World War II historical fiction. Again, it is a romance. It's about a girl named Audrey. begins in the Depression, and eventually she's living with her grandfather. She decides to go traveling for a year, and she goes to Europe, and she meets a man and she follows him to China. She ends up staying in China to care for some orphans, and that's her story. And then that sort of goes into World War II when you know, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and it's just interesting. Like this is the first time I'd ever read anything about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and it was really, like, you know, really got my toes wet. And it's also, you know, quite a nice little romance story as well. Again, Audrey falls in love with a much older man. But Danielle Steele, as I said, writes heaps of historical fiction. They're just some of my favorite ones that I began with. There are plenty more that you could pick from, but you know, if you're looking for an easy way to get in and you know, aren't disengaged with the Danielle Steele novels, I know they're not for everybody, but they're an easy way in. The next type of historical fiction that I'm going to talk about is, if you've been at my channel for a while, you will know that I'm very much into thrillers, so I'm assuming that you're probably into thrillers as well. So that is another subcategory of mystery, so mystery thrillers and adventure novels. And the book that I have for that is Half Moon Lake by Kirsten Alexander. This is a relatively new book. It's set in 1913 in the American South, and a little boy from a wealthy family goes missing, and this family looks for him all across the world, all across the country, and eventually a little boy is found, and this family claims him, but it appears that he is not actually their son. He belongs to another family. And Half Moon Lake is actually based upon the real story of Bobby Dunbar, and it is really heart-wrenching. I mean, I'm not going to tell you the ending or what happens, but it's really quite sad. You know, two families are ripped apart, and I don't think either family walks away feeling very happy or very content with what happens in this novel, but it is really good. You get some interesting insight to post-Civil War Louisiana, and also pre-World War One, what was happening in the American South. So good option if you are into thrillers or mysteries and you want to make your way into historical fiction. So it's kind of like a crossover. The next type of historical fiction is also, you also might be interested if you're into thrillers, and this is the subsection of historical fiction that is to do with time travel and alternate histories. So the book I chose to talk about for this subcategory is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. This is probably one of my favorite Stephen King. I haven't read a lot of him before, but I really enjoy this book. And this is about the protagonist, Jake, who discovers a way to travel back in time, and it is his mission to stop the assassination of JFK. So remember, when we're talking about historical fiction, it doesn't need to be something that happened, you know, you know, hundreds of years ago. It doesn't need to be a huge jump, a substantial jump back in time. But you know, going back to I think he originally goes back to 1961, and he has to live in the 60s for several years before the assassination. And this book is just so good. You get to see like the life of the 60s, what was happening. You get to see the turmoil, the racism, all of that. It's just a really good book, and it's also very fast paced. I mean, it is a huge book. It is it's about 750 pages long, which is, you know, big, but it is very fast paced. I read this in probably 2 or 3 sittings. It did not take me long at all. But that's another way, if you're into thrillers or if you're into Stephen King, a way to make the jump into historical thrillers. Another subgenre of historical fiction that you might be interested into is historical biographies, and this is one of the first that I read after the Danielle Steele books that really sort of got me hooked on the genre. And it is The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory. So this is the first that I read, and I think there are a couple that Philippa Gregory released before this in the series, but there are heaps that she released afterwards. And what Philippa Gregory does really well is she takes the most interesting things about a historical figure and she builds a story on that. So for example, The Other Boleyn Girl. So it is not actually based on Anne Boleyn, it's based on her sister Mary. And one of the contentious things about Anne Boleyn is that her sister Mary actually is believed to have given birth to Henry VIII's children. And this explores that dynamic. And it's Mary's perspective of what happened to Anne and the lead up to Anne's execution and how her family was impacted by Anne's death. After I read this book, I was hooked. It's not completely factually accurate, but it gives you enough to get you hooked. Like there's heaps of references to real people, there's heaps of references to real events, and it's a very good starting place to go and just like get your feet wet so you can go and do further research and get yourself immersed in that period. I think that Philippa Gregory's research is really well done, and yeah, it's a really good way to start. If you enjoyed this one, then there's plenty of other books that you can go on to. Philippa Gregory also does books on Henry VIII's other wives. He does one for Catherine of Aragon, Anne of Cleves, pretty much all of his wives. He also does a prequel series which is based on the War of the Roses. So you have the White Princess, the White Queen, the Red Queen, books all based on the War of the Roses. So if you're not sure, the War of the Roses is what happened before Henry VIII, before the Tudors took power. So that's a good series to get started with, and the language is pretty easy to read, and it's also very much a romancy styled novel. Another historical biography that you might enjoy is Memoirs of a Geisha. This is one of my favorite all-time historical fictions. This is also based on a real person. You can actually get her real biography. I can't remember her name, but you can buy an actual biography of the woman this is based on. But this, I think, is just done so well. It really paints a picture of what it was like to be a geisha, what Japan was like pre-World War II. Yeah, it's just a really, really good book. It's easy to read. The language is easy. It's just, yeah, it's really gripping, and I really enjoyed it. The last subgenre of historical fiction that I'm going to talk about today is series or sagas. So the series or saga that I really enjoyed was the Saxon series by Bernard Cornwell. So this is set during the Viking invasion of England. It's based on a character named Uhtred. It also spends a lot of time talking about King Alfred the Great. It's really well detailed, it's well researched, it's based on fictional characters but around real events, and it's, for me, this is like the tale of the unsung heroes, the unsung the warriors that won the kingdoms and they won the battles for the kings, and I really enjoyed these books. So if you want to see if you enjoy it, The Last Kingdom on Netflix is based on the Saxon series, and that is quite a good TV show. I really enjoyed it. That's how I got introduced to this to this series. So, you know, if you want to dip your toes in, go and have a go at that TV show. And I've got a few honorable mentions to talk about now of books that I just really enjoyed that you might like to go and have a look at. The first one is The Help by Catherine Stockett. Just a beautiful story about racial segregation in the American South in the 1960s, about the fight for equality, about the fight for equality in the South for African Americans. Really beautiful. Movie's really good as well. I'd get your hands on this if you can. Also, I really enjoy pretty much all World War II fiction. This one was a really beautiful story. It's Letters to Sky by Jessica Brookmole, and this one is this is a really beautiful story about during the First World War, two people that begin writing letters to each other. I can't remember why they begin writing letters to one another. I think it's an accident that this woman on the Isle of Skye in Scotland begins writing letters to an American, and you can see this friendship develop, and it eventually turns into love, and eventually the tagline here says, through their letters they become people they wanted, they become the people they wanted to be, because they are able to express themselves and their fears through their letters. And it's just a beautiful story that is told through just a series of letters from these two people. I think it is completely in letters. Yeah, it's told completely in letters, and it's just beautiful. So that's one book you might enjoy. And that brings us to the end of the video. So if you have any questions about historical fiction, I'm more than happy to try and answer them for you. Most of the historical fiction that I read now is set in either World War I or World War II, just because that's my main area of interest. I do still like to explore other types of historical fiction, but they're the main subgenres that I read. Yeah, if you have read any of these books, if you have any suggestions about some good historical fiction that you think I might enjoy, please comment below. If this book has given you any ideas, please let me know what you are going to check out. Even if historical fiction is not for you, if historical fiction is not for you, that's completely fine. I realize it's not for everybody, just like I'm not into all of the genres that you're probably interested in. But thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. It's lovely getting to chat with you again, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!